Welcome to our third webinar on online abuse in sports. My name is Gary Sinclair. This webinar series is presented jointly by the FIA, DCU, and the United Against Online Abuse Coalition. So the first two webinars we've had have been very interesting, and we got a great reaction. We also have an exciting lineup of speakers over the next few months. So, for example, we have Dunka Antunovic from the University of Minnesota, who will be presenting in August. And we have Itowitz Rodrigo from Loughborough University, who will be presenting in September. So please look out for any communications or any emails concerning them. I'm sure you'll hear from us. So we're delighted to have Kim Toffoletti with us today to speak about online harm in Australian women's sport. So Kim is an associate professor of sociology at Deakin University in Australia. So she's delivering her talk today at 8 p.m. today, so she deserves extra bonus points for that. Her research is focused in two key areas: feminist studies of the media, including social media and women's sport, physical activity and well-being. So her current work investigates the connections between digital media cultures, gendered visibility, and building communities of safety and connection online. So Kim's talk will be followed by questions. So please stick around for the chat. Please also note that all of our series will be recorded and will be available to access on the website. I've left the link for the chat in there. So check that out as well. So yeah, I'll hand you over to Kim. Really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Gary. So just to acknowledge the research team, I was working with Dr. Caitlin McGrain and also Dr. Sarah Redden, based in sports marketing. I'm a sociologist and feminist theorist, and Caitlin works in gender and media, and Sarah in sport marketing. So a good, I think, interdisciplinary mix. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways on which my university, Deakin University, does business, and to pay respect to the ancestors and elders of the lands on which Deakin sits, and to acknowledge First Nation people and their contributions they make to our learning communities, but also to extend that acknowledgement to the First Nations people of the lands of which people may be joining us from today. So just a quick summary of the project. This was a funded project, and it was funded by the Victorian government, which is the state in which I'm based, the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, and in particular it was the Office of Women, who had been observing the kinds of, I guess anecdotally, the kinds of hostility towards women athletes. At the time, the Australian Football League had instituted a women's league, and this brought much media attention, but also considerable backlash, and this drew attention more broadly across the media in Australia, and raised questions, I think, also at the governmental level around trying to understand what was going on. And so they funded this project with the aim of trying to understand the prevalence of online harm in Australian women's sport. So not only just in the local football league, but more broadly the impacts of some of these kinds of online engagements. So very much wanting to understand the impacts, and also for us to start to identify some of the ways we might respond to these kinds of negative online encounters. So to do this, the team developed a survey which was distributed anonymously to national and to state sport organisations, and also to national sport organisations. So it was a nationwide study, and that was followed up with 8 in-depth interviews, and these were participants who volunteered to speak to us And that really added a depth and a dimension to the survey results. So just noting, we had 138 participants. So we had about over 200 that responded, and not all of those responses were eligible to be used in the study. I think what was really striking was we had participants from 32 different sports. So we often think of online abuse being targeted towards women athletes in the most high-profile codes, but we had women from a range of sports, things like shooting, sailing, cheerleading, as well as your more kind of sports at the cultural centre of Australian society. So that was quite instructive, and I'll come back to the significance of that as we talk through some of the recommendations. So we found that gendered online harms were prevalent. This is not surprising given that the recruitment for the survey was, have you witnessed or experienced online harm? But I bring this slide up because I think it shows that witnessing was a large part of it. We found that this language allowed us to sort of encompass the diverse range of risks and impacts that were occurring through online interactions and behaviours, and they were not necessarily always social media. So what we found when we were surveying about, and we surveyed around several things, like what kinds of digital media and social media people were using. I won't go into that, that's all in the report, but I really want to focus on the types of harm, so then we can move on to sort of thinking about the impacts of that harm. So the types of online harm we were seeing were things in the, for instance, the comments function of social media. You know, go home and wash the dishes, those kinds of things. So that's been quite well established in the work of, I imagine, many of you here that are attending the webinar. So you'd be familiar with that. Also a lot around body shaming, so calling out, you know, athletes' bodies and what they're wearing. Also hostility directed towards queer athletes, and also athletes who might be taking an activist position and calling out things like racism or sexism in their sport. They were subject to backlash and hostility. We also saw other kinds of sort of sexual harms that were happening that weren't just in public forums, in the sort of public social media spaces. So participants in the interviews talked about things like being blackmailed for nude images, being in a group call with other teammates and the coach exposing themselves, and the circulation of pornographic images. So things kind of in their direct messaging and things like that. So things that weren't publicly visible, they were experiencing. So I think that's notable to bring up in terms of the kinds of methods that we're currently using to kind of track online abuse. There's other kinds of forums and spaces where this is happening outside of the public eye. We also were really struck with some of the stories that participants were telling us that really, I think, forced us to recognise a broader kind of range of harms. And so these were things that included sort of the use of technologies to exclude athletes, sometimes from their own kinds of groups. So using, you know, digital technology, sort of private messaging to exclude them, and they felt very that had negative impacts on them, or in some cases to undermine and misrepresent elite sportswomen. So you'll see in the box that's the black box there, athletes were really mindful of the fact that the decisions of what to put online were often selective, and if they weren't visible online, that had an impact on their various aspects of their either performance or mental health or feeling towards their sport and their status in that sport. Other athletes felt misrepresented by the kind of social media that their own clubs were posting about them. Or they felt harmed or undermined by, for instance, a misreporting of their performance on an official channel by their club or by their sport. So these kinds of things I think were interesting because they're kind of things I think sit outside the sort of definition of online harassment or hate that we would typically see. But women really were at pains to raise these things as problematic. And I think so those kinds of functions like closed chats groups or direct messaging, even things like hashtags and emojis were used to sort of facilitate online harmful kind of behaviours and encounters. So being able to kind of capture and contextualise and understand the impacts of those, I think are quite important, and they're not always detectable through sort of data monitoring or data scraping software. So I think that just to point that out as a key insight, that this wasn't necessarily always recognised as harm. And so I think that had sort of issues in terms of how to report and, you know, what was considered as kind of requiring intervention. So I'll move quickly into impacts. The survey results indicated that, when we asked in the survey, we asked a sort of a sliding scale, you know, the effect of these kinds of online harms or engagements. And the sliding scale went from a little to a great deal. But when we were sort of analysing the data, we felt reluctant to kind of break it up according to sort of degree. Because again, I think what was the issue for us is we didn't want to downplay, and that often women themselves will downplay the harm or try to brush it off because they're being reminded that it's not severe enough. So they might say something and someone else will say, well, you know, you should toughen up, or you've got to deal with that yourself, or this is just part of the, you know, the athlete experience. And so we decided to sort of group together those responses to get a broader picture of the fact that these harms were occurring, and that also if something is affecting, if you feel that this is affecting your performance a little within an elite athletic context, a little still means a lot. You know, we're often talking about sort of small percentages, and we're kind of often working with athletes to kind of maximise their performance. So if this is something that is troubling them, the degree of trouble, I don't think is the issue here. It's about recognising that this is having an impact in several ways. And so one of those was in terms of performance, and 71% said that it was affecting their performance. 81% said that it was having an impact on their employment, sponsorship and economic opportunities. And 85%, so the largest percentage, said that it actually is affecting their well-being. So these are pretty astonishing figures. And what we found was that the impact tended to be compounded if someone had both witnessed online harm and been targeted by it. So I think something else that's worth raising at this point is to recognise that these impacts were unevenly felt across the population of athletes surveyed. So an athlete's sexuality or their race or ethnicity did have an impact on how they were experiencing these harms. And this was quite interesting because we were seeing that it had a greater impact on the well-being of athletes who were same-sex attracted or culturally and racially marginalised, but less so on their athletic performance or their economic opportunities. And so our kind of, I guess, preliminary thinking around this is that those athletes often aren't granted many kind of economic opportunities because they are already sort of marginal within that landscape. They often don't sort of conform to the, I guess, the sort of heteronormative white ideal of the kind of sportswoman who can be sellable. So perhaps it was having a less of an impact because those opportunities aren't coming to them in the first place because of discrimination on the basis of race and sexuality. And in terms of performance, perhaps there just wasn't the luxury of being able to underperform, particularly again in these environments where being, identified as different is already comes at a cost for you in terms of how you might be perceived and your commitment to your sport. So not letting it affect performance is a possible kind of explanation there. But what we saw is that was then rebounding on their own well-being personally, so they're having to carry that load. Very much so, and often in an isolation around hesitancy to report, and I'll talk a bit about that also in a moment. So I think just before I move on to seeking support, I think another impact that's worth identifying here is that it was also impacting their online behaviour. So a very kind of censoring dimension to these online harms, in the sense that athletes were closing social media accounts in response to having experienced harm, or they'd be avoiding certain platforms, or stop talking about certain topics because they recognise that it would cause sort of blowback or negative feedback. Or they'd be editing their posts so that they'd be kind of more palatable. So again, I think there's a real regulation of gender, particularly women, when they speak out against things that they consider to be unjust, are really copying it for that. And really as a sort of form of censoring, again, women's kind of ability to occupy public or social space. So recognising these impacts, we found that in terms of support seeking, the majority didn't really seek support. So over half didn't do that. But those who did tended to go to the private sphere, so friends or family, and far fewer tended to sort of seek out something like a coach. And interestingly, things like players' associations were quite small, but that might be because a lot of the sports that participants identified with playing don't have a strong players' association, or they're not represented by a players' association. And I think this speaks to how we might think about responding to some of these issues in terms of who has access to kind of resources to address these kinds of harms. So there was, what is heartening is there was some knowledge about different kinds of ways of reporting online harms. And there's quite a few there. So in a way, what that might also tell us is there's not really a clear reporting pathway, but maybe a bit more of a scattergun approach. So it's maybe a couple of different ways of interpreting that. And, using sort of formal channels like in Australia, the E-Safety Commissioner, although that was quite small. We see that 8% wouldn't make a complaint, but there were a range of places that people felt that they range of reporting pathways that people feel they could follow. That doesn't necessarily mean that they necessarily did. Their knowledge about where to report doesn't always translate into reporting. And there's good reasons for that. Athletes recognised quite quickly that reporting often didn't lead to any kind of resolution. And the vast majority of our respondents who actually did report online harm didn't say they felt any safer after doing so. So there's a real lesson to be learned there, that you might have all the reporting pathways in the world, but if it's actually not resulting in anything that makes athletes feel safer, then they learn quite quickly that it's an ineffective mechanism to respond to the issue. So I want to finish up here, maybe spend the next sort of 10 minutes or so talking about some of the recommendations that emerged from the findings, with a view then to just really opening up the discussion for the rest of the session. So we developed a set of 4 recommendations, really so that organisations could consider some options and think about what might be applicable to their own kind of their own kind of sport and its context. And it's really, there is no one size fits all model, is really what we'd say. It is around trying different kinds of approaches and really thinking through this as kind of a multiple solution kind of issue. And I say that because you'd be very well aware of this, that there are many companies that will provide technologies to remove harmful content, and that's really being sold as the solution. But there are limits to that, particularly if you're an athlete whose organisation can't afford to buy that kind of software. Doesn't necessarily address the root cause of the problem either, which is online hostility and hate towards women in public life, in this case, elite athletes. So I think that the technological piece is one part of the solution, but we're offering some other kinds of things here. And I think these things also respond to some of those more broader harms that are caused, that might result from digital interactions that might be not in sort of public facing sort of social media spaces. So I think, the first recommendation was really around that kind of helping expand that understanding, that online harm here is actually much bigger than comments on someone's Twitter feed. So strengthening that organisational understanding is really important here, and that happening at all levels. So a real whole of organisational approach. And so that means that if athletes are speaking, for instance, to their coach or to another staff member or support member, everyone's on board with understanding what constitutes harm, online harm, and having a clear understanding of what to do from there on in. And so I think it is about, particularly at this stage, about, trying different things. And that might be technological, but it might also about, changing cultural norms around workplace HR too, in terms of what might support people. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So really seeing it as a workplace issue, particularly given the kinds of negative impacts. So clearly the findings were showing that the current reporting mechanisms weren't really working for making athletes feel any safer, or that the issue was being resolved. And so for us, that was really about trying to think about how reporting channels work, and to think beyond what the kind of established reporting mechanisms are. So currently, Sport Australia, which is the peak body for sport in this country, their recommendations are largely around reporting through the eSafety Commissioner, which again is a government body, that athletes found that was not necessarily effective for them, particularly because harms like exclusion from digital groups or being misrepresented online were not really reportable through those channels because they don't really meet the threshold of online harm. And even in law enforcement agencies doesn't really meet those kinds of thresholds. So they were finding that those kinds of channels to report weren't useful for them. And so thinking about how we might address that differently or develop alternative reporting mechanisms, I think was really important. And also, I think also recognising that athletes really felt fear of repercussions from reporting and a significant lack of support after reporting. So again, how might we develop reporting pathways in which people feel safe and they feel like they have some agency over deciding how they want to address the problem? And I think particularly in terms of culturally and racially marginalised groups, that's quite important, that feeling of safety. And I'll talk about that in a moment in the next slide. So some of the things that we were suggesting is, whether athletes can involve a support person or a family member when they're reporting, and just recognise or be listened and heard in a non-judgmental way, and then work in a collaborative way with their sport organisation around various options for reporting. And I think accountability is a big one here too. People don't feel like they want to report if there's no accountability. If they report and they never find out what happened, they never find out whether the issue was resolved. So having accountability built into reporting mechanisms, I think, is really important, and clearly assigning responsibility for following up on the issue. The third recommendation really comes back to recognising that this is an issue that doesn't just affect elite women athletes in the bigger sports, that it's actually athletes across a range of sports. And so this really raises questions of equity, recognising that not all elite women athletes receive comparable investment in their safety and wellbeing from their organisation, and that's just because some organisations are just much better funded and resourced than others. And so there's an equity piece there around which women athletes have the luxury of, detection, delete and detect software, and how do we move beyond this becoming a kind of individual organisational solution towards something that ensures that all elite sportswomen have access to these supports, resources, tools, and advice. This idea of ensuring that the supports are culturally safe and athlete-centred is very important. Athletes didn't feel that there was much support for them once they had reported. And so whether that's employee assistance programs or offering them pro bono legal counsel, some want to take those avenues, others don't, but allowing them to have some agency around choosing what feels appropriate for them. And that point around clear and consistent communication of pathways, not only for reporting, but in terms of accessing support. Athletes felt very at sea once they had reported. They just really didn't know what to do with all these feelings and what had happened, and there was very little there for them. This final point about empowering and protecting athletes really came out of athletes speaking about feeling really strongly about being able to respond publicly to racism, sexism, harmful online posts, homophobia, ableism, much of the kind of messaging from sports organisations around social media use is very much don't provoke, don't say anything, don't bring this on yourself. And so athletes we spoke to were really critical about that approach, and they felt that it's really important for them from a social justice perspective to actually respond, not simply accept this kind of social media abuse. And so I think that kind of training that sort of invites women to minimise engagement can really compound the silencing of women in digital publics and the censoring of women's voices. And so that kind of training that says, mute or ignore or block, they just really didn't find that helpful or supportive. So thinking about how employers or sports clubs can actually stand behind athletes and allow them to have their voice, I think is really important here. The final recommendation is really around this issue of safety and how to create safety between an employer and an athlete or an organisation and an athlete, so that they don't fear reporting, the repercussions of, not being taken seriously. Some were quite fearful that they would invite scrutiny of their own social media activities, or they'd have to hand over data. So there were real privacy issues there, that if they raised something that they would then become the objects of investigation. So those kinds of things, I think, were really stopping them from feeling safe, and particularly for athletes of colour. They're in Australian society, and I imagine in others this would resonate too. There's a real history of sort of the policing of brown and black bodies, and so athletes of colour might not feel safe reporting through official channels. So whether that's the police or even their own clubs or their own sports integrity units, those things can feel very unsafe. So just recognising that, I think, is really important, and building, I think, a trust. And part of that is to know that if they're disclosing, that it's being acted on and taken seriously. So those kinds of issues around safe discussion and disclosure were really important for the athletes that we surveyed and spoke to. I think this was also a real issue in terms of athletes who reported being negatively impacted by their own club's media units, who were posting things about them that they felt were untrue or mischaracterised them. And so I think to enhance safety, one of the other things that we can think about here is giving athletes a greater say about what's being posted online about them by their employers. So how clubs or social media managers might actually work with athletes when producing content about them, or at the very least just obtaining approvals around what they're saying about them, I think was really important for the athletes that we spoke to. Okay, I feel like that was a whirlwind of information that just went blah at you. But I'm happy. Would love to hear from others and yeah, and engage in thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. With questions there already. I think the best way is to raise your hands or through the Zoom function or to post something into the chat. Neil has a question already, so Neil.
Yeah.
Neil, I'm just gonna take a sip of water.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Sorry, the Wi-Fi is a bit patchy here. Thanks a lot, Kim. That was really interesting, and apologies for the delay joining. I came from another meeting. Your findings were really interesting, Kim, but I'm also amazed just at how closely they align with research that I've been involved in. I've just come to the very end of a sort of a pan-European project that's all about bullying in sport. Now, it's not elite sport, but there are just so many parallels, such as sort of fuzzy understandings of what bullying is or isn't. You spoke about intersectional experiences and that tendency for, say, minority persons to experience more abuse. Another factor, another finding that was so similar is this fact that so many participants don't actually report harm, which is really alarming. But I'm sorry if you covered this at the very beginning, Kim, because I missed the early slides. But one of the things that really stood out for us in our research was the role of coaches. So coaches, in many cases, being sort of both the perpetrators of bullying or harm and being the key actors in responding to it. So what I'm just wondering, and you touched a little bit at the end there, but like I'm wondering, how would I put it, sort of about the internal circulation of online harm. Like, does your research tell you anything about maybe peer-to-peer harm? You touched a little bit about it at the end around athletes of color, but maybe you could tell us a bit more about that. Thanks a million.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, your work sounds amazing, and we're similarly seeing resonances with colleagues at other universities who are doing stuff more broadly around safeguarding. So I think that what's happening in the online space is not removed from what's happening in other spheres of sport. And yeah, our athletes did speak about things like coaches weaponizing digital technologies to cause harm. So that is, I guess, slightly different perhaps to the sort of online harassment which might be occurring through comments functions of the sort of social media page. So some of the participants we spoke to mentioned that kind of thing. So that kind of bullying would go on in online spaces, and I showed a quote in which someone had their coach expose themselves to them on a call. I mean, this stuff is just, it's like beyond belief. And also peer-to-peer. So, and that was very much around, chat groups that are excluding certain athletes and not others. So me, that's an interesting, I think that resonates with what you're doing around how these technologies themselves can actually be tools that can, I guess, facilitate or allow for bullying in ways that might not be seen, I guess, in more public spaces. So I think they're the two examples that sort of come to mind around that. Yeah.
And,
Thanks a lot, Kim.
And Kim, we have another Kim in the chat who has a question. Her research is looking at female fans as opposed to athletes, and just wondering how you work towards defining what your research has affected by or impact. I don't know if you see in the chat there.
Oh, sorry, I'll try to bring up the chat question.
I think there might be a typo in there.
Female fans of sport will love that. Love any work on women's sport fans. That being another pet project of mine. Wondering how you work towards defining what your research is affected by or impact. Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting, the definitional stuff. I think there's an interesting, I don't know if it's a tension, but I think there might be different kinds of approaches here. So one is the typology approach. So let's develop the categories, and then let's see who meets those criteria or fits into those categories, right? So I've developed a typology of how women come to sports fandom. So there you go. I'm not a hater of the typology. The typology has its kind of uses. But I think with this project, we were less concerned around kind of hard definitions and much more interested in the athletes. If the athletes felt that it was affecting them, then we took that seriously. So we asked them, how was it affecting you? So I think with the survey, that was a blunter instrument because we did give them the option of performance, well-being and economic, thinking they're kind of key areas in which women's athleticism, you know, the literature tells us that these are kinds of key sites of importance for women athletes and their progress and success. So, and we did try to measure sort of the scale of that, but again, I felt that was limited to sort of say that, you know, if they felt, you know, whether it sort of felt a lot or a little, I think there's still an impact there. Oh, gee. So I think taking a perspective of asking them what was harmful and why it mattered to them was more important to us than kind of trying to categorize what constitutes impact or affected, and then use their kind of language and terms to sort of narrativize the significance of that for them. So I'm not, you know, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it's more, I think, about approach.
I think
Maybe
it's
others
interesting.
can jump
Yeah,
in
and I think
there.
it's interesting because your threshold is much wider, I think, around online harms. Even some of the examples that you've used there, like I wouldn't have seen discussed or defined as online harms, but I can see how they could be, especially cumulatively, you know, if they add up, like, you know, things like not getting photographed when you're in a race, or even small misreportings of details around you know, performance. So I think that's really interesting. I think it's important to expand that threshold. Sorry, Katie has her hand up there. She has a question.
Oh, thanks, Gary. And thank you very much, Kim. It's been a long day for you. So hope all's well in the Australian evening out there and for everybody else in between. I really enjoyed the presentation, so thank you. You'll know that there's a couple of members of our TOHIF team on the call, Tackling Online Hate in Football. So I know you'll have further discussions about that. I'm going to focus maybe on one thing in particular that I picked up from your methodology. And you had over 100 survey respondents, and I think it was 8, you'd said, interviews. One of the challenges we're having in TOHIF is encouraging women to speak to us about their experiences of online harms. And I wondered if you encountered that, or if it came through perhaps and was reflected in the number of interviews you had, or maybe that was part of your intention, and whether you have any potential explanations for that.
Oh, Katie, well, I'm sorry to hear that it's hard, but it was really hard for us too. So if that makes you feel any better. Yeah, and even the survey, we kept it open a lot longer than we intended to originally because different sports have different schedules. So it was really about reaching athletes when they, you know, had the time to, and also really working with our liaisons within the state and national sporting organisations. We really needed to find a champion in those organisations who wanted to keep pumping out the call, because some, you know, it's a hit and miss thing. Sometimes they get the survey, you know, so it was all organisational recruitment, so they didn't have anything to do. We wouldn't know who decided to take it or not, and the organisation would never know who decided to take it or not. But if an athlete might see it a couple of times and go, I'll do it later, and then maybe on the third go, they actually click on it and fill out the survey. And we built the interviews we built the interview recruitment into the survey. So they had the option then to select. So we probably did have, probably might have had double that actually said they'd be happy to be interviewed. But again, the scheduling thing, it's just a really tough hang, you know. I mean, I don't know what it's like where you are, but in Australia, they are like an over-sampled population. Everyone wants to speak to women athletes. And they are underpaid. They're working multiple jobs for all of this. So I wonder if that actually is part of it, that they think it matters, but they actually have to prioritise survival.
Thank you, Kim. And very quickly in response, I suspect what we're seeing, although we can't say it yet because we're still coming through with the data, is that partly because of that context you've described, and also the policy gaps as in responses, I think a lot of women are beginning to, as a self-protective mechanism, to self-regulate and to internalize some of this, which is very understandable. But it means it becomes an additional research barrier to really trying to open this space up. And the irony is that it's actually more important to do that precisely because of the nature of gendered online harms. So I think we're in a difficult research space, actually.
Yeah, but I mean, that's why it's so important that you're doing your work, and I know there are others at Loughborough, and maybe that's Lauren. I'm not sure if that's Lauren Birch's sort of team that's speaking a bit, speaking in this seminar, but they did some Olympic stuff too. I think it's just so important that we're collecting and collating from all places so we can assemble a really robust picture. Because as you said, the sampling is just really, really hard for those practical reasons. But I also think you're right that there's a futility. There's a why do I need to say this again to someone who's just not, and things aren't going to change. So hopefully some of this work will start moving the lever on that.
I think especially with ours, it's qualitative interviews as well. And like, I think what you're saying there, Kim,
Gary's frozen for me, or am I frozen?
His audio dropped out for me too.
Oh, okay. Sure, he'll jump back on in a moment. I can see you, Dunya, it's so nice to see you. Dunya and I go way back. Perhaps.
Hello, Kim.
Yeah, it's so good to see you.
Good to see you too, and hello to everyone. I guess I'll go ahead with my question. Well, thank you, Kim, for another thought-provoking talk, as usual. I particularly appreciated your, expansion of conceptualizations of online harm, and obviously there's a lot of different aspects to talk about, but I'm particularly interested in that element of athletes' relationship with journalists. And you mentioned one example of the misrepresentation of performances, and in some of the other studies we've seen, athletes reported that they posted something on social media, the journalist would kind of just take the post, take it out of context, maybe misrepresent who was in the picture and create a story around it. And so I was wondering if how you interpreted those findings, particularly in terms of that relationship, and what are perhaps some recommendations for journalists that could be applied from this discussion, and especially in relation to your other work around the visibility of women's sports, right?
That the kind of marginalisation of women within the sport media itself is a harm. And so it feels exacerbated when you actually do get media attention and they just can't be asked getting it right. Like, it feels insulting. You feel demeaned. You already feel like you're not taken seriously. And then on top of that, you're not accorded the respect of just getting the basics right. Like, that feels enormously frustrating. And so maybe this raises the question of what's the difference between frustration and harm. But I think that when we look at it in the context of a sustained diminishment of women as athletic subjects, and in terms of their subjectivity, it does feel harmful because it's corrosive to your status, to your sense of self, to the value that's accorded to you in society. And so, for journalists, I think it is those questions of accuracy, so even things like getting names wrong, you just feel so undermined that no one makes the effort. I think the other tricky thing in that space, though, often with reporting that's happening on social media, some of that's done. We know that there's a lot of unpaid labour that's done around women's sports competitions, even elite ones, because the mainstream sports just don't cover them. So this is where you have either the club is paying, some intern to kind of go out there and post something on the Facebook page or what have you, or even sometimes they're getting information from the competitions themselves, and they've provided inaccurate information. So there's different sort of, places along the line according to who's reporting. It's not always sort of, mainstream media. I'm not sure about recommendations. I'd have to think about that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not yet. I'm thinking about it.
Okay, that's a paper.
Yeah, yeah. And there might be, you know, contextually specific recommendations, of course, right? Depending on, I mean, you spoke a little bit about the Australian context, right? But I imagine that some of the recommendations might translate across context, while others might be culturally and nation specific, depending on the involvement of governing bodies and so forth.
Yeah, definitely at the level of clubs that might be using their own social media channels. Again, you know, they're often quite they're badly paid. They're often quite junior staff, and they're expected to do an enormous amount. They're expected to monitor and post and do all those kinds of things, and also themselves be subject to some of these kinds of hostilities and harms, particularly if they're responsible for filtering and monitoring. So, you know, certainly recognising that labour, you know, is not necessary, is also exploitative. In that regard too. I'm not sure if Gary, I can't see all the faces on the call. I'm going to hand back over to you to field the rest of anything.
No. Thanks sorry about that. I cut out there now. So I'm sorry I missed Dunia's question. Yeah, Beth, I think you have your hand up. I can see on my screen.
I did, yeah, thank you, and thank you for the talk, Kim. That was really fascinating. We've actually kind of started to move on to what I was going to ask you about, which is this idea of, in the specific context of women's sports, the additional labour that's expected of women athletes to grow the sport, to be close to the fans. I think we're seeing that a lot, particularly in the UK context. We're seeing it elsewhere as well, and social media is one tool of that. But, you know, the culture of, you know, having to stay behind and sign lots of autographs and be close to the fans, and that responsibility that's expected of them. I just wondered if that kind of contradiction is starting to come out through your research, in terms of how, kind of, on the one hand, some leagues have actually encouraged athletes to use social media and to promote the sport, which surely then puts them at risk, increased risk. But then on the other hand said, oh, well, if you experience abuse, we'll come off it. Like, yeah, it seems conflicted to me.
Yeah, it's a really important point, Beth, and thank you for coming along. It's so nice to see you too. I think that's part of the sort of the rub here, and I think that really came out when we looked at the sort of economic impacts, that women were seeing that they were actually required to use social media. You know, often it was actually mandated that they were required to have things like public, but also, you know, things like WhatsApp. So they were required to have sort of communication platforms, but also many of them were kind of expected, if not mandated, by their clubs and organisations to have some sort of presence. And yet there was no responsibility on behalf of those clubs or organisations to take any kind of safety measures around athlete use. And so athletes were feeling really stuck, because they're like, the only way I can get visibility is if I use these things. And I'm also promoting my sport in an environment where I'm constantly being told that my sport is hopeless and not worthy and needs more fans and that no one's interested. So yeah, they were doing a lot of that labour. And so when they were encountering this abuse, and it was, you know, for some it was altering the way they were using social media. You know, they retreated or they posted less because of the costs on their own well-being. But what that meant too is that they weren't as visible by sponsors. You know, so they were potentially risking the opportunities that come through that increased visibility. So they were certainly recognising that and talking about that, and that really did emerge both, I think, in the survey data around impacts, but also in the narratives, very much so. So I guess in some ways just confirming what you're saying. So I'm not sure if that there's something else I could say to extend that, but just to say that yes, that was coming through.
I think we might squeeze in one more question if anyone has one.
Yeah, if no one else does.
Yeah, go ahead, Colin.
Fire away. Kim, thanks very much. It was a really informative and enjoyable presentation. I just wondered if whether many of the athletes you spoke to discussed the role of gambling in provoking abuse. It's something I'm part of the TOA project with Katie and Gary, and it's something we're looking at the moment. And I've seen it cited in media accounts of abuse, particularly against female athletes before, but there hasn't been a huge amount of research done on it. So I was just curious if it had come up in any detail and as to whether it, I suppose, had any different characteristics than the kind of abuse they face otherwise.
Great question, and I'm glad you raised that. It's not something that the athletes that we interviewed, or even because our surveys had some text box so they could elaborate, and no one brought up gambling. And I was a bit disappointed about that because we'd actually been working with someone from tennis who said, I really want my athletes to respond to this because this is a big issue in my sport, that we have 15 and 16-year-old girls out on the circuit and they are on their own and they're in a hotel room and they're getting things through their phone saying, you lost that match, I'm going to effing kill you. Like like it's actually scary, right? So I was, hoping that we might sort of touch on that because it was quite clear through speaking to not only tennis but other sport organisations that this was something that they knew that their athletes were encountering, but we didn't get anyone responding that way. So whether there's an opportunity perhaps in future surveys or interviews to build that in, I think might be a more target or specific question, or to think about sports where that's really prevalent, and I think tennis is a really good example, I guess, obtain a little bit more depth and understanding around that. Have you encountered any of that in what you're doing, Cole?
Yeah, it's come up a bit. Particularly, we've talked to say like people involved in football, soccer here in Ireland, which would be kind of a much sort of smaller media profile than other things, and they say that's the kind of worst stuff they get. Tends to be like people gambling on the other side of the world who've placed your team on an accumulator to win, and suddenly you have this person like on another continent telling you they hope your children die in a fire or something because you've cost them money. So yeah, it has come up enough that it is something we want to look into. But as I said, as far as I can see, at least any of the literature you look at in terms of gambling and abuse largely focuses on gambling addiction, which is of course a problematic issue and probably crosses over with this one. But yeah, I definitely think there's more to be mined there. But
yeah, we've been looking at it a little bit on the Twitter data, and I know because you mentioned tennis, Theo put his hand up because so Theo, do you have a kind of comment on that?
Yeah, actually, Kim, good presentation. Thanks a load. We actually at the FIA industry conference on online abuse, the head of integrity for the ITF spoke on their monitoring of abuse at professional tennis players. 13.2% or something was related to gambling. So it was very disproportionate compared to, say, we met with World Rugby and FIFA and it was a kind of a disproportionate thing in tennis. And one of the things is, I suppose tennis is very different in that it's an individual sport. There is a lot of matches, a lot of players. So the betting tapestry is more complicated and complex. It's very global. And then there was a kind of an indirect comment that he made, which I thought was interesting, but I'm not sure that other people picked up on it. But he sort of implied, well, we provide real-time data to the gambling companies, the betting companies. And so, there's probably a relationship between the real-time nature of tennis and the amount of things that you could bet on versus rugby or soccer, etc. Well, there's lots of soccer matches. The tennis is a very specific thing where there's a lot of different situations. And he was saying that they've encountered situations where gambling rings or groups of bettors might post a whole load of abusive content just prior to an important match or something like that, just to slightly put someone off. That kind of thing. So I think that gambling, it's kind of one of these things where I think we all know that there's something there that's triggering online harm. It's more likely to be a direct message type activity, and so that therefore it's protected. And one of the challenges that he said that they have is that, they're only getting to the point, and in fairness to the platforms have only evolved their tools to the point where a third party can take control of an account without seeing historic private messages. So the difficulty is, even when a federation wants to intervene and say, well, listen, we'll manage some of this for you, some athletes are worried that, oh, I don't want you seeing my private content from before. I don't mind you managing it during this tournament, but I don't want you having access to legacy content. And so the platforms are only building those tools right now. And I know from my, I'm on the analytics side of TOHIF and the FIA project, and I can see the challenge that the platforms have, because the nuances between online harm, offensive language, and for want of a better word, and it's not a word I like using, and what some might say is banter, or just casual kind of offensive use of language or imagery. It's very difficult. For instance, like a big problem we have is we have a really good AI model for classifying homophobia, ableism, racism, all these things. But when we operationalize it, it finds it very difficult to distinguish between tweets about homophobia and actual homophobic tweets. And so if you take, say, Euro 2020, there's 25,000 or 30,000 tweets about homophobia, but there's only maybe 5,000 that are actually homophobic. And so that's still a very large number. So I'm not going to discount, but in fairness to platforms, it's an extremely difficult problem when you're dealing at massive scale. And therefore, I think the federations have to have a significant responsibility to intervene. At the same time, though, the platforms need to provide tools to the federations that allow them manage specific types of features on someone's account, so that they can protect, someone has their privacy and they have protection, as opposed to it being a binary decision right now. Anyway, sorry, I'll disappear offline now again. Sorry.
Last word, Kim.
Great points. Great points. And I mean, I think you speak to the context-specific nature of sports and the kinds of abuse and hostilities that might be occurring because of the way the sport is played, the global nature of the sport. So I think sport-specific studies would be really important here. I mean, there's a lot about football out there, and that's great and important, but we're seeing a range of stuff. And I think the second point that you raised that's really important here too is some of the limits of technology. Detect and delete software is the solution. Because as you said, you might be deleting stuff that might be activism or resistance or challenging abuse. And if the technology can't distinguish between what's abusive and what's a critique of that abuse, then you just throw in the whole thing out. And so I think that's why I think a range of responses are important here, rather than we can outsource this to a company who's just going to make it all go away.
Absolutely. Right. So as always, we run a little bit over time because, we have lots of questions, and that's a good thing. So I thank Kim once again. Really appreciate it. Absolutely fascinating discussion. You can see the link in the chat and on the slide there for the report. And I'll be in touch about the next talk that we'll be having. We have a few during the summer. And thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.